be looking at foundational aspects of data protection from a cyber perspective. So Chris, over to you if you want to take the screen.
Thanks very much, Ray. And yeah, thanks for taking the time to join us this morning. Thanks for the invite. These are great events. We're happy to be back doing another one. So yeah, if quite able to live up to that amazing introduction from Ray. But yeah, so my name's Chris Dyer. I am the channel pre-sales representative for Cohesity. I've been working for the company since around April, and I won't give you my whole CV or anything like that. But you know, prior to that, I've been working in the field of data protection and storage for the last kind of decade or so, and hopefully kind of been able to pick up a few kind of bits and bobs over that time. So the purpose of the presentation today is to look at data protection really as a sort of a foundation in terms of being able to prevent, but kind of more importantly, I guess, being able to recover from any sort of potential cyber attack should the worst occur. Is it going to be a solution to all of your problems? No, not necessarily. But if you're smart about the way that you're managing this, it really would put you in a situation or in a position to potentially really dig yourself out of the fire. So we're going to kind of try and keep it more generalized. That I'm conscious I don't want this to be a product pitch, but I will reference back to the way that we do things at Cohesity, because I think it's best to talk about what you know, and it will help kind of frame some of the points that we're discussing as well. So right. So state of cyber attacks today. I mean, ransomware this is not news to anybody at this point, right? We're seeing such a huge acceleration in ransomware attacks across the globe, and increasingly what we're seeing is this is becoming mainstream news, right? So it seems to me that on almost like a daily basis, through whatever your sort of news portal is of choice, we're seeing reports of big kind of ransomware attacks on big household names. I think one to call out in the last couple of weeks, we saw Manchester United in the UK getting hit in their sort of IT network around training and scouting of players. Some of these things will start to personally affect you as well. So for me, being a keen runner and triathlete, the attack that took down Garmin services for a good week or so, that's personally affecting me and my ability to upload workouts to Garmin Connect, this, that, or whatever. So you can see, it starts to affect you. You start to think about not only the financial implications in terms of a potential ransom that you pay, in terms of potential downtime that you're looking at, but also reputational damage that you can suffer as an organization through these kind of things. I think what we're also seeing as a trend over time is that these attacks are becoming increasingly sophisticated and diverse, right? So if you think about the kind of the first generation of ransomware, is very much kind of targeted at coming in, hitting your primary storage systems and encrypting your files, your VMs, your what have you. But increasingly, we're starting to see that kind of diversify. The newer generation is also kind of is going after what we would consider to be low-hanging fruit. So this can be even things like more legacy kind of backup vendors who've got less secure infrastructures. It can go in and it could encrypt your backups, which really leaves you in a much more perilous position in terms of being able to recover from any kind of potential issue. Some of these legacy things, they weren't designed in this kind of era with these things in mind. So some of the time we're looking at infrastructures that are relatively unchanged over the last decade plus. Some of these things are kind of 20 years old, and that can be problematic as a result. We're also starting to see things that would be traditionally considered as more secure platforms like Linux and Mac operating systems start to become targeted as well. And we're even starting to see a trend in terms of these criminal organizations actively working together to resell access or to resell a platform. and you're almost getting into this kind of ransomware as a service type of model, right? So things are, I would say, getting worse, and I think that's a trend you're only really realistically going to see accelerate over the next kind of year or so. So I mentioned the cost implications. I mean, the figures that you've got on the slide in front of you here, I'm not going to read them because they're there, right? But they're astronomical. This is big money that we're talking about, and I think especially when you start to think statistically speaking. The average payoff for an organization at the moment in terms of a ransomware hit, if they do elect to go down the paying it off kind of route, is around $1.1 million. And despite the fact this is something that's actively being discouraged, there's a mandate from the FBI, for example, to not do this. And there is some kind of rumbling that there may in the future become additional fines that are levied to organizations who elect to make these kind of payments, or that it might become, you know, prohibited in some capacity. You're still seeing around 26% or so of organizations electing to pay the ransom as that kind of get out of jail free card. So that's a lot of money, right? And despite all of these things, I think you're seeing over the last year, the last 12 months, 178% increase in terms of organizations who are electing to go down that route. The cost of downtime really is a big killer point here, right? And it's something that I'm going to cover a little bit more in the next slide. But something else to consider is that even paying the ransom doesn't necessarily avoid the downtime. So I had an anecdote from an American colleague of mine who was dealing with a customer who had one of these attacks. They had 500 of their virtual machines encrypted, elected to pay the ransom because they decided that this downtime was just untenable to them as a business. They needed to get back up on their feet quickly. What they were presented with was 500 completely unlabeled encryption keys. So that is not going to be a quick process, you know, of elimination of somebody manually having to go and through trial and error apply these keys on a VM per VM basis. You know, it's just a nightmare. So, you know, in some cases, paying the thing is not even necessarily a guarantee of lessening that damage, of lessening that impact to the business. And in terms of impact to the business, I think some of the stats that are on this slide really do kind of boggle my mind a little bit, to be honest with you. Think about like 11% could recover data and apps within 3 days after an attack. Well, 3 days is a long time to be suffering any kind of an outage. So you look at it, on average, downtime to a sort of a mid-sized organization will, you know, if you're losing business transactions through your website, whatever the case may be, the average impact is somewhere in the ballpark of 300K per hour. So 3 days is a long time. Statistically speaking, you also need to think a large number of these businesses who suffer prolonged outage in terms of their sort of business continuity actually go on to go out of business within the, you know, within that sort of following kind of 12-month period or so. So this downtime really does have massive implications, and I think it becomes increasingly important that we have some kind of framework in terms of how we're gonna protect ourselves and how we're gonna come back in that kind of case of potential issue. Last thing in terms of sort of framing this stuff out, right, is that it's not always necessarily a malicious or criminal attack that we need to be mindful of. So as you can see from the slide, in excess of 50% of these downtime issues are actually caused either by system glitches or by human error. So these are, you know, there are other considerations. It's going off topic a little bit, admittedly, but these are other things that we need to think about from a continuity standpoint, from a recovery standpoint. While it might not necessarily be nice to think about, the threat from inside the firewall, from your own people, is something that you really do need to be mindful of. You know, these internal attacks, they do happen. So I think in this day and age, it's increasingly important to be looking at things like compliance officers as being a key in terms of preventing this kind of thing. Having a proper segregation of responsibilities and permissions, and some of that sitting with users who are outside of the IT organization, you know, not having the all-powerful administrator type of thing. Cool. So data protection as a framework, right? So I kind of alluded to it at the beginning of the presentation, but I mean, the main message here is if you're looking for a silver bullet, really, there isn't one, right? It needs to be a very multifaceted approach, not just from a data protection standpoint, but in general. So, I mean, obviously, while the focus of the talk today is the data protection side of things, there are other things you need to be mindful of, right? So you need to be doing things like keeping all of your patching up to date, potentially employing security officers, educating your staff, right? These are all other good things. These are all good best practices that you should be doing. But really the focus today is going to be on the protection side of things. And even within that, I think a multifaceted approach really is the key in terms of success here. So you can see in my funky green pyramid here, we've sort of divided that into 3 categories. Preparation. So when we talk about preparation, it's really in terms of making sure that our attack surface is minimized and secured, in terms of making sure that our backups are secure. So if we are in a situation where we need them, they've not been compromised, we're actually able to utilize that insurance policy that we're obligated to have, right? The next step would be around detection. So being able to detect some kind of anomalous activity, like a ransomware attack, for example, being able to report, alert, and then to action against that is obviously going to give us a significant leg up in terms of our ability to respond. And then the last tier here, the tier 3, would be the actual response itself. So if things do go sideways, and with the best will in the world, the best preparation, you know, the reality is if you had the best system possible today, the speed of evolution of these things would mean that potentially tomorrow that would not be the case. So even with the best preparation, sometimes things will go awry, and then it becomes really about how we respond to that, right? So how am I going to be able to restore that production data, to restore my production systems in the least possible time, with the least possible impact to the business? And I would maintain that really all of these 3 things kind of need to dovetail together, and in such will give you more of a kind of a complete strategy in terms of your way back from these things. So let's dig a little bit deeper into some of these points, right? So preparation, having a secured platform, I'd say, is key. Something that's built secure by design, I think in this day and age, is also increasingly important. But having a platform that's consolidated in the way that Cohesity is, for example, is also very very key in terms of reducing that attack surface. So, for example, with Cohesity, we can integrate not only data protection but also DevOps, also native file capabilities, for example. So you're just reducing that attack plane. You're giving them less to go after. Access is also a key point here, right? So if we're looking especially into environments that are multi-tenanted, if we're looking to offer some kind of you know, user-based self-service, or we want to involve kind of key stakeholders within the business, so administrators around databases or virtual machines or whatever the case may be, being able to segregate those environments properly using full sort of role-based access and control is increasingly important. Being able to use things like 2-factor authentication as another kind of step around that sort of security process, I think, is increasingly key. Being able to use things like write once, read many, copy protocols against data to prevent, you know, malicious admin-based deletion, for example, becomes a really kind of key thing. I talked about protecting the copies of the data, so making sure that those copies are secure. Historically speaking, we've looked to stuff like the 3-2-1 rule, right, and use of air gaps. So the 3-2-1 rule, if you're unfamiliar, we want 3 copies, 2 different locations, one of which is inaccessible. In the past, we would do that by writing onto tapes and sticking the tapes in a cupboard somewhere, or send them off to Iron Mountain or what have you. These rules are they're still applicable, they're still appropriate, but you're also going to see in more sort of modern solutions, more modern infrastructures, that we can look to write data in an immutable fashion, right? So it's read only, it can't be manipulated, it can't be sort of messed about with after the fact. And one of the strengths that we have at Cohesity is the capability to kind of bring all of that stuff together to really give you a very multifaceted approach. Last point on here, and this is something I see a lot of organizations fall foul on, is actually testing and validating your backup and recovery strategy. So why don't we ensure that in some capacity, if we do have a problem, that things are going to work the way that we want them to, that our recovery workflows are appropriate, that we've built a service catalog so that we're ensuring the first thing that comes back is our mission critical workloads and not, I don't know, our, HR databases or what have you. So testing, I think, and validation is an absolutely key pillar, and something I see a lot of places honestly missing out on. Detection. So we talk a bit about detection, right? And there are a few different ways around doing this, but really the goal is the same, right? So as and when things are starting to go a little bit awry, we want to be able to pick that up. We want to be alerted. We want to be we want to be told about it, and then we want the opportunity to be able to action that, to segregate a potential infection, to restore that data to the last good known point in time. There are a lot of third-party applications that you can look to do this with. With Cohesity, we've got the capability to run applications directly on the platform itself. So one of those applications is targeted around this anomaly detection. And we look at a number of kind of different criteria in order to assess that anomaly. So the signals, for example, that we look at with the Cohesity application would be the ingest and write pattern of the data. It would be the entropy of any incoming data. And then lastly, we're just going to look for any sort of suspicious patterns in terms of mass addition, deletion, or any kind of bulk or patterned modification of files. Those three things are kind of analyzed together to then give you like an anomaly score, like a weighted score. And then we can set thresholds on alerting you to, based on these criteria, we would see an issue around this file or whatever the case may be. And from there, we can then, look to take those actions. We can look to take that. We can look to segregate it. We can look to restore to the last good point in time. And that response really, I think, is the absolute key thing here, right? So as I suggested earlier, sometimes even with the best preventative measures, stuff is still going to happen to you, right? So it becomes about how we're going to come back from that kind of brink of disaster. We talked about that sort of cost in terms of reputation and financial cost around that downtime. So how quickly do we get back up on our feet? I think having a proper documented sort of service catalog type of approach really is a key thing here, right? So it's being able to make sure that our mission critical workloads are first back, and really ensuring that we've got a platform to kind of minimize that recovery SLA as well, which is, again, it's an area that we're very strong around, I would say, with Cohesity. We'll have a little look at that on the following slide here. So, I was very conscious that I didn't want to make this too much of a product pitch, right? But I think it's important to talk about what you know. And I think that the way that we do this kind of nicely frames it. So not to say that there aren't other things that are able to do bits of or similar things, but I think it's worth just talking around a little bit around the way that Cohesity, lockdown, we provide you with a secured platform that really does cover off all of these bases and gives you a very kind of a rounded solution in terms of the preparation, the detection, and the eventual response. I'd say the three kind of key components here for me is in terms of the guards that we put on the platform. It's in terms of the access, so the restriction of access. And ultimately, the result therein is compliance to sort of various different standards along the lines of sort of FIPS, PCI DSS, et cetera, and all of those things really kind of tie together to give you your rounded approach, right? We talk about the platform being secured by design. I mean, that it's on the slide as a bullet point here, but I mean that in itself to me is really the culmination of all of these things together. And I think that's incredibly important, right? So I'll go back to the legacy vendor architecture. I really do think that in many of these cases, as I sort of highlighted, some of these architectures are 10 plus, even in some cases 20 years old, and in that respect, they're always going to be playing catch up in terms of trying to secure that infrastructure. Some of it's Windows based. I've seen instances where sort of legacy solutions have actually had the infrastructure itself targeted, right? So if you lose that master server, you lose the index, you lose the catalog, and in that respect, you can't recover anything, and you really are facing some fairly serious issues right off the bat. With Cohesity, we are a next generation platform. We consider disruptive for a reason, and we're very much kind of born in this age of ransomware. So we're designed with these things in mind. We've been built from the ground up to be able to withstand this kind of stuff. In terms of access and control, I'm not going to dwell on each one of these points, especially given that I have a few minutes remaining here. But I talked about the importance of granular role-based access and control around multi-factor authentication. One of the other ones I want to call out on here is actually the use of a service backdoor. It's not something you'd necessarily think about too much, but it's something that we've seen organizations have issues with. I mean, to call out another anecdote of an organization who found that this particular vendor that they had been dealing with had the service backdoor in place, so their support users could log in and proactively kind of monitor the system or whatnot. But they'd use that platform to go in, inadvertently cause some havoc that was unrepairable from. They could not recover from that. They ended up losing data as a result. And you'd be surprised the amount of places who still will use this as an approach. With Cohesity, absolutely not the case, right? So we will create temporary tokens and manage things that way. So that issue around a service backdoor in effect goes away. Detection. So I talked about detection. I talked about the fact that we can run applications directly on the platform. So obviously the detection of anomalies based on those criteria as we described is key. But we also run a number of other applications that are proprietary, that we've written ourselves. Some of them are third party. And some of those actually cover other aspects of the data protection piece as well, that kind of tie quite nicely into this. So I mean, the thinking here is, rather than making sort of extraneous copies of the data and shifting those off to other application servers or what have you, why not bring the apps to the data rather than the other way around? And I mean, all of these are kind of geared around giving you a bit more strategic value from this data that we're obligated to keep from this insurance policy that we're obligated to have through these sort of copies and copies of data. And some of these applications will tie into things like vulnerability scanning. So again, I go back to my scenario whereby I've detected my anomaly, I've isolated it to a particular VM or what have you. I can then start to use those extra apps to go in and do that vulnerability scanning to ensure that what I'm bringing back is going to be okay, it's going to be clean, it's going to be usable. And then the last sort of pillar here is that response, and that's an area that we're fantastically strong around, based on the fact that we are a next-gen architecture, based on the fact that we're software defined, based on the fact that we have a proprietary snap tree technology. These things all come together to drive a feature that we call like instant mass restore. So what that means is, in case of any kind of potential issue, I can be restoring many virtual machines on a very sort of a very quick, sort of near instantaneous basis. So if I am sort of struck down by a problem that's going to cripple my production systems, I can utilize that instant mass restore capability to bring things back incredibly fast. And there's a bunch of things on here that we could talk about at great length. But really, I think the important thing is all this stuff really comes together to give you that complete approach. No single one of these things is going to save you, but considering all of it together, I think is really the key here, and really what's going to help you from a data protection standpoint and ensure that you're in the best sort of possible position to defend yourself against this stuff moving forward. So I left, I think, a couple of minutes for Q&A. Hopefully I've kept reasonably to time, Ray.
You have indeed. Absolutely.
Brilliant.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris. Very interesting discussion, and a couple of questions that have arisen from that is how often are Cohesity speaking to customers about ransomware? And a second point to that question is, has that changed since COVID has come into force?
So I would say we speak to pretty much everybody about ransomware at this point. So even if you haven't necessarily been haven't necessarily had the misfortune to be affected by it, it's becoming increasingly prevalent. It's really at the forefront of most people's minds, and I think the majority of conversations that we're having are competitive displacements, if I'm being candid, right? It's not a lot of greenfield sort of sites that we're working with. And as part of that, you know, it's legacy. It tends to be legacy stuff that we're you know, potentially replacing, and being able to sort of remove those sort of potential problems does become key. In terms of an increase down to the corona issue, I wouldn't necessarily, I mean, I think I'd say there has been an increase, but I wouldn't necessarily attribute it specifically to the sort of the corona sort of side of things. I think the increase really is just down to the fact that there's been such a significant increase in the volume and visibility of these attacks as much as anything. Yeah,
and thanks for that. And when it comes to ransomware, there's a bit of a grey area as to whether or not you pay the attackers or not. We as Digit ran an expose last year or the year before about a Glasgow-based data recovery company that had claimed that they could crack the encryption and get the data back without having to go into negotiations with hackers, but actually behind closed doors, due to this sting operation, which was conducted by cybersecurity researchers, did pay the ransom. And then charge the client a premium on top for the data recovery process. You know, we exposed that as a result of this research. And my question really is, would you ever advocate yourself giving in and paying?
Well, I think, as you said, Ray, I mean, my instant sort of response to that is no, but as you suggested, it's never always going to be a completely black and white type of situation, right? Yeah. So I think there is a strong argument to say that by paying, you're empowering these guys to continue what they're doing, and you know, I would tend to lean more that way. But I mean, you can also look at instances, documented instances where organizations have failed to pay a relatively modest ransom request, and then actually ended up with significantly higher costs down to sort of network rebuilds and stuff like that. So I would say really to try and avoid it, but you know, in some cases even having a threshold at which you might need to look at that could be part of a wider strategy, as it were.
Okay, and a question from one of our delegates as well is are you able to give a brief demonstration of working in the Cohesity platform? I think that's something probably that we best direct that individual to the exhibition stand, I think, where the team will be able to.
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, most definitely. If you come and see us at the stand, we can certainly arrange that for you. Always more than happy.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gents, I'm now going to bring on David Goodbrand from Burness, Paull. David has spoken for us before, as has a number of his colleagues, and he's going to be looking at the awareness of new laws and regulations on international data sharing. So, David, if you'd like to unmute yourself and come on, I shall bring you on the video. And if you'd like to start your first slide, that would be great.
Thanks, Ray. I'm not going to start with slides if that's okay. So yeah, the end of international data transfers. I'm David Goodbrand. I'm a partner in the technology and commercial division of Burness, Paull, and I head up the data privacy practice. Am I not? Okay, hang on. Video starting now. Got it right. All right, a really warm welcome to this session where we're looking at data transfers. So is this the end of international data transfers? I deliberately picked this title to be provocative. On the one hand, it's clearly madness to now contemplate a world where data is only localized and can only remain in particular territories and can't be shared internationally, because so much of how our businesses work, our supply chains and suppliers communicate, and how we interact generally online is wholly reliant on the continued free movement of data. However, on the other hand, some recent changes and new proposed changes in the law and regulations on data transfers are really beginning to put a strain upon how businesses can actually lawfully transfer data internationally. The hurdles and compliance burden do seem to be getting a lot higher and potentially very expensive. So in this session, I'm going to look at international data transfers from a UK perspective and look at things like the impact of Schrems. Are we really ready for transfer impact assessments and supplementary measures? Touch briefly on the new standard contractual clauses, and with Brexit in mind, and it's hot in the press at the moment, can data continue to flow post 1st of January following the transition period? And these are some really pretty tricky issues for all businesses and organizations to consider in order to ensure data protection and privacy compliance. So hopefully this will shed some light on what needs to be done. What I would say is, from a data privacy lawyer's perspective, it does feel as though we're receiving numerous data protection or privacy gifts through our door at the moment, almost as regularly as the Amazon deliveries at my house for Christmas. So where are the main points? What are the main points to consider regarding international data transfers? If we take it right back to basics, the GDPR essentially prohibits transfers of personal data to countries outside of Europe, as it assumes that such countries do not offer an adequate level of protection. We all know that's not practical, so the GDPR permits transfers to what is known as third countries, countries outside of Europe, as long as appropriate safeguards are put in place to protect these data transfers. Okay, GDPR, as we probably know, is only covers the processing of personal data. That's data about living individuals. It doesn't apply to any other form of data or data sets, such as business data, operational data, confidential information, that kind of thing. However, personal data is very likely to be commingled, forming part of lots of other data, and it's unlikely to be processed separately from these data sets. So effectively, the obligations of GDPR to protect personal data really impact and affect all data that is flowing and is being transferred, because it's so difficult to separate personal data from everything else. Now, this might be seen by some as an overreach. I mean, why should GDPR dictate how we process all our other data? But in reality, it is very difficult to segregate data sets. And so as a result, GDPR is effectively the default standard for all data transfers and international transfers. I'm going to bring up a couple of slides so we can help her to aid our discussion. Hopefully that is now on screen. So first of all, we'll look at the choice of safeguards available under GDPR to allow for these safe transfers of data. We're looking at data flows not within Europe, but we're looking at data flows internationally. So we're going from Europe out to the rest of the world. This may be maybe a flow of data to a subsidiary business in Australia, or to a supplier who's processing your personal data or payroll data, for instance, in Singapore, or it could also be out to a cloud provider in the United States. There's loads of different data flows outside of Europe that all of us are involved in on a day-to-day basis. So the first safeguard, there are a small number of countries that have been given what's known as an adequacy decision by the European Commission. And that's effectively the European Commission essentially finding that the laws of these countries are, they offer equivalent protection to GDPR. The laws are effectively very similar to the privacy laws we have here. So those countries include Japan, New Zealand, Canada, Switzerland, and they have basically, if you transfer data to these countries, you don't really need any additional safeguards. Certainly this is the pre-Schrems situation. For those countries that don't have an adequacy decision in their favor, if you wish to transfer data to those countries from Europe, you need to look at some other form of protection. So basically, to recap, safeguards are effectively a way of guaranteeing that the individual's privacy rights are being protected. You've got obligations to data subjects in wherever you are, and you want to ensure that their privacy rights are protected, regardless of where the data is transferred to and regardless of who's processing it. There are limited derogations for certain transfers, but they are really only for one-off transfers and are not much use to most businesses. Binding corporate rules, that's very complicated, so I'm not going to go into that. Suffice to say, you need regulator approval for that. Privacy Shield was another safeguard you may have heard of, which is a very specific arrangement between Europe and the United States for the transfer of data. But following the Schrems II decision, which we'll speak about in a minute, they ruled that the Privacy Shield framework is no longer valid. You can't use that as your safeguard, your get out of jail free card, as it were, to transfer data from Europe to the US. So you need to look at something else. So Schrems II was about Max Schrems. He's an Austrian privacy advocate, and he's taken a series of cases now to the courts. And his original complaint was about data transfers by Facebook Ireland to the US. But he was really looking at it through the prism of the PRISM spying program and the Snowden revelations, and saying, you know, are these countries actually protecting our data? Who's actually accessing it? Finally, the most common safeguard that most businesses will still use is to transfer data from Europe to elsewhere in the world, is what's known as the standard contractual clauses, SCCs. And they're sort of a standard set of terms and conditions which, if they're adopted in their entirety, will effectively guarantee an adequate level of protection for the data flow through a binding contract. So this was the situation pre-Schrems, pre this decision in the summer. So let's look at what happened after this decision, because a lot has changed. So the main thrust of the Schrems case was that Privacy Shield was no longer valid. We know about that, so that's why it's got a red line through it now. So if you're solely relying on that, you have to find some other solution, and most people are looking at standard contractual clauses. It was also decided that the use of standard contractual clauses for transfers to the States was good, so that's good news if you're currently relying on standard contractual clauses. However, the court didn't stop there. As anyone relying on these standard contractual clauses now also needs to consider the second part of the decision. As the courts held that if you use these clauses as your sole safeguard mechanism, you now need to assess your data transfers on a case-by-case and country-by-country basis to determine whether the laws of the country to where the data is actually being sent, transferred, will adequately protect individuals' data privacy rights. So the thrust behind that was the concern that if data is being shared with a third country, could it be accessed or intercepted by governmental authorities or other third parties on national security or other grounds within those third countries? So now the courts are saying, well, you should really be looking at that on a case-by-case basis. So what does that mean in practice for companies that have been relying on the standard contractual clauses to transfer data? Well, the European Data Protection Board have now confirmed that this means that organizations will need to undertake what's known as a transfer impact assessment before transferring data outside of Europe, whether that to be to an affiliate, whether that to be a processor, whomever it is. If there's any data being transferred, you need to undertake this transfer impact assessment. And that's a massive jump and hurdle to jump over. Albeit, obviously, good intention was to try and protect individuals' data rights and freedoms. But you're no longer having a contract with standard contractual clauses is no longer enough. You can no longer treat the inclusion of these clauses as a simple tick box exercise. So all types of international data transfers where the data exporter wishes to rely on these standard contractual clauses as their safeguard measure you need to undertake your own assessments of the laws of the country to where the data is being sent. So you, the data exporter, are responsible for conducting due diligence and assessing the impact of the transfer, which, I mean, let's face it, is likely to be extremely daunting task for many businesses to try and work out what the laws of a third country are in order to protect data. So in early November, the European Data Protection Board issued its recommendations on the types of additional supplementary measures, they call them, that organizations can adopt to ensure that their transfers are compliant with GDPR and now with the Schrems ruling. And the recommendations are out for public consultation. I think the good news, looking at those recommendations, is that they do actually provide a useful number of case studies for businesses to look at. And the case studies are accompanied by supplementary measures that could be employed by organizations to ensure an essentially equivalent level of protection to that is guaranteed under the GDPR. However, it also gives examples where no form of supplementary measures could ensure an essentially equivalent level of protection. And what that means in practice is if you can't demonstrate that the data is going to be protected to an equivalent way as it's protected in Europe, then the transfers of data shouldn't be permitted at all or must cease if they're already ongoing. I mean, just think about that, turning off the taps because you're not able to determine that there's sufficient protections for people's data. That's going to have a massive impact on the way people do business. So any organization making transfers of data outside of Europe to a country that doesn't benefit from an adequacy decision needs to now take these additional steps. So that's these standard contractual clauses, transfer impact assessments, and these safeguard measures. So there are a number of recommendations which I think the European Data Protection Board are putting out there to try and help us to get our heads around and what this means in practice. So they suggest a 6-step process that you should look at. So the first step in this 6-step process is to know your transfers, to know basically requiring us to think about and carrying out an analysis of all transfers of personal data to third countries outside of Europe. And that includes remote access if your staff are based internationally, or it also includes for cloud storage if you're storing data in the cloud or for backup purposes and that the servers happen to be located outside of Europe. So this exercise must also identify any onward transfers of data from the processes outside of Europe, maybe to sub-processes, and those sub-processes may be located in third countries. So effectively what it's trying to do is look along the contractual line to ensure that the data is protected along its journey, whether it be to the processor in a third country or a sub-processor someone else. Second step is to verify your transfer mechanism that you're relying on. So we've talked about adequacy decisions, we've talked about standard contractual clauses. These are sort of your transfer mechanisms. The third step is to assess the effectiveness of your mechanism. So as I said already, the guidance makes it clear that standard contractual clauses in and of themselves will not always be enough to ensure personal data maintains the same level of protection as it carries in Europe. So exporters must therefore identify any laws or practices in the relevant third country where the data is to be sent, which could prevent the data importer from complying with their obligations. So it talks about in the recommendations looking at lots of different factors, such as how the local laws might affect a transfer, including the purpose of the transfer, the entities that might be involved, the types of personal data being transferred, and the format of that data. So you need to sort of do a bit of an analysis there. Step 4 is to actually put in place these supplementary measures. These are these additional steps to protect the data. So where the standard contractual clauses alone don't provide effective protections, exporters will be asked to put in place additional supplementary measures, which can be put in place to sort of cure these deficiencies. So yeah, supplementary measures, as we're saying, need to be identified on a case-by-case basis, meaning effectively if you transfer data to the same third country but to a different party, a different importer, maybe for a different purpose or whatever, you might not necessarily have the same supplementary measures in place for that data transfer. So each and every data transfer needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis, which, as you imagine, might be a bit of a headache for many. So the recommendations are supplementary measures really are a combination of technical, contractual, and organizational measures. So the sorts of supplementary measures that the board have in mind for technical measures might be end-to-end encryption, which is obviously very useful, or pseudonymization, which is effectively depersonalizing or disaggregating the data set. These are technical measures, and they're not a complete solution, but they will go some way to try and protect the flow of data. The recommendations also suggest contractual measures. So you might want to take additional contractual measures, add to your standard contractual clauses to give additional protections. So perhaps you want to actually specify specific technical measures that the recipient needs to take, or you might require the local data importer to provide you information about the extent to which local public authorities can access personal data. And you might want to contractualize that you want to have audit rights to actually look at what's going on, particularly if there is any data that needs to be disclosed by the data importer to public authorities. So these are some contractual measures. And finally, organizational measures. These are other additional safeguard mechanisms. So these are things that really you as the data exporter, the party sending the data out of Europe, might take. So these might be, you have maybe you have internal policies governing data transfers with clear reporting responsibilities, or you may have to have detailed record keeping requirements of data subject access requests or requests from public authorities. So this list within the recommendations isn't definitive, it's not exhaustive, but it's actually, if you cherry pick parts of it, I think it provides a useful and helpful starting point for companies that are transferring data out with Europe to put in place these additional safeguards to protect the data flow. And once these appropriate supplementary measures are in place, provided an essentially equivalent level of protection has been reached with the combination of the clauses and the supplementary measures, then the transfer can proceed. But crucially, transfers should not start or should be suspended until that threshold is reached, which, as I said earlier, is going to cause a lot of headaches. And it puts a lot of pressure on companies to get their assessments right. It's up to the companies to make the assessments rather than any regulatory authority, which again puts a lot of pressure on individual data transfers. Step 5 is procedural steps. I'm not going to go into that, but step 6 is effectively to say that it's not a case that you can just do these assessments on a one-off basis and that's it. It talks about doing regular assessments of your data transfers to third countries on an ongoing basis, which effectively means regular reevaluation. So where are we with this? What does this mean? It's clear that the European Data Protection Board has put a lot of thought into outlining a very comprehensive process which tries to provide a secure route to maintaining transfers of personal data to third countries. However, for its comprehensiveness, the guidance, in my view, is not practical and it will be extremely challenging for organisations looking to be compliant without grinding international trade and data transfers to a halt. So that's where the end of international data transfers bit comes in from a presentation heading. The due diligence requirements for local laws are particularly onerous and are unlikely to be achievable by private companies alone. So I fully expect this guidance will result in an increased involvement from in-house legal teams, external counsel, and other lawyers in assessing these data transfers, which will obviously add to the cost. And this obligation falls on businesses themselves rather than to central or governmental authorities. I think risks divergence. You're being asked to assess the laws of third countries, and that's a difficult task for anyone to take on. The other thing is some businesses may diligently follow this guidance, invest in the process, and find themselves unable to continue certain data transfers, whereas some businesses may take a much more of a risk-based approach and just continue on regardless. And I suppose given the sheer volume of the data transfers taking place, it will be really interesting to see how supervisory authorities actually manage compliance with the guidelines. It's clear that it's now a large task facing all organisations as well as supervisory authorities to get to grips with the guidelines and to ensure that data transfer mechanisms are supplemented where appropriate. Oh, right, I've mentioned the B word, or I'm about to mention the B word, post-Brexit. As the end of the Brexit transition period approaches, it's important also to consider what impact, if any, there might be, Brexit might have on your data processing activities. So here's a slide of some of the issues post-Brexit. The first question we get asked a lot is, what laws will apply next year? And will the GDPR still apply in the UK? And I think many people that are asking that question are secretly hoping that they're not going to be hearing anything about GDPR at all going forward. But sadly for them, as with the word Brexit, we are likely to be hearing a lot more about GDPR and indeed Brexit for many more years to come. So as of the 1st of January, substantially the same requirements will apply in the UK, but effectively a UK GDPR will replace the current European GDPR from 1st of January in the UK. So the way to look at it is the UK version of GDPR will effectively apply to processing of personal data if you're located here, if you're located in the UK, and if you offer goods or services to or monitor the behaviour of individuals in the UK. Whereas the European General Data Protection regime will continue to apply if you have maybe branch offices or other businesses in Europe, or if you offer goods or services to or monitor the behaviour of individuals in Europe. So you could have a situation where businesses are located in the UK and have branch offices in Europe, or who offer goods and services outside of the UK. They may need to comply with both the UK and European versions of data protection laws, which might be confusing. But anyway, that's the laws, that's the background, and that's where we are just now. So the second point is transfers of data. What about transfers of data to and from Europe post-Brexit from the 1st of January? So most businesses, I think, are likely to have an existing flow of data to and from Europe, whether as a result of the territories in which your business operates, or you may deal with customers or suppliers or partners who are based in Europe, or you may outsource some of your activities to a third party in Europe, such as payroll processing or IT support, that kind of thing. Whatever it is, there are steps you need to take to protect the ongoing free movement or flow of your data. I think we've heard a lot in the press recently about the free movement of goods and services and people, but the free movement of data is equally as important to many businesses. The main takeaway here from the slide is that the UK might not be regarded by the rest of Europe as having an adequate level of data protection come Brexit Day, which will impact the ability of companies to transfer data. Certainly just now, and based on everything we are hearing, it seems highly unlikely that the UK will receive an adequacy decision from Europe anytime soon. And in some ways, this seems a bit harsh because UK law, after all, will pretty much be entirely based on the European data protection law from 1st January. So effectively, we're taking on board all of the European law. So why would Europe not say it's adequate? However, like so many parts of the separation arrangements and the new working relationship with Europe, this is something that's not really been fully debated or finalized yet. It really falls into this sort of no deal basket of risks or known unknowns. So what should you do? What can you do? If we're falling out with the regime and we're effectively becoming a third country, I think you need to ask yourself, do you transfer data to Europe? The one-way transfer of data from the UK to Europe is actually protected. So if all you're doing is transferring data from UK to Europe, that's protected under UK law, which has already recognized that Europe provide an adequate level of data protection. But data does not tend to flow one way only. It tends to flow two ways or multiple ways. So if you've got a flow of data from Europe back to the UK, and if you import personal data from Europe to the UK, then you may need to do something to protect that flow of data. And also, if you onward transfer any European data within the UK to another country, you might have to think about this as well. So assuming that Europe has not recognized the UK as having an adequate data protection laws, then in order for transfers to continue, we need to put transfer safeguards in place. And we've talked about these throughout. So as you'll see from the red pen, our choices are becoming a lot more narrow now. And the most likely option still remains these use of these standard contractual clauses in your agreements and arrangements. So the standard contractual clauses can also be used to transfer data from Europe to the UK post-Brexit, which UK will be a third country until an adequacy decision is made. But where a European exporter is exporting data or transferring data from Europe to the UK, they will also need to undertake, as we've talked about already, a transfer impact assessment in relation to those data flows. And they may also require the UK importer, UK businesses, to implement additional safeguard measures. And these are the ones we just talked about as well. So lots to think about. And as if all that wasn't complicated enough, there's something else to be aware of. And the eagle-eyed amongst us will have spotted a reference to the new SCCs, new standard contractual clauses. In mid-November, these were released for consultation. And actually, the consultation period ends today, would you believe? But I think that means that these new clauses will not be adopted in time for 1st January, and actually probably won't be adopted for a period of time. It's also not clear whether the UK would adopt these new standard contractual clauses post-Brexit at all, so that lots of things to think about. There are lots of good things about the new standard contractual clauses once they come into play, but I could go on for another 30 minutes on those. So I think that will have to wait to another day. So long story short is that all of this will impose a much higher regulatory and compliance burden on all businesses and data exporters that transfer personal data outside of the UK or outside of Europe. Loads of moving parts to think about, which is why I think our data protection colleagues are all scratching their heads at the moment. So for the time being, you need to go with the current standard contractual clauses, warts and all, but they're the ones to rely on. But you watch this space for the new standard contractual clauses as well. I know I'm almost out of time,
Thanks for that. I'll actually pose the questions if you want. There's just a couple of quick questions I think we can get quick answers to, if that's okay. I think one that stood out for myself is if the Data Protection 2018 Act is the UK's implementation of GDPR, why is there a need for a forthcoming UK GDPR?
Sorry, the UK GDPR is effectively the Act plus some additional regulation. Effectively, the UK law is saying we'll take all of the existing European GDPR and put it into the mix. So that's what I mean by UK GDPR.
Okay, and just one more quick question before we move over to Sorcha. If data is only transferred in transit, not stored, does it count? How can that be controlled in an environment where much is done via the internet and cloud?
So I would need to look at some semantics here, but yeah, I mean, if it's literally just in transit, arguably it may not be being processed in that country, but I think we'd have to look at you know, if it sits on a server somewhere out with Europe, then it will be into the fold, unfortunately. Everything will turn in its facts, as lawyers love to say.
And one last quick one from Elaine. Interested in our risk exposure for supplier agreements N2, given Privacy Shield being in place, but now that no longer applies. So whether you see this as a legal responsibility to review a procurement one or a DPO issue. If it's a long answer, then we'll ask Elaine to jump on the platform and target you via private chat for a response to that. But is there a quick answer to that one? Happy to speak to Elaine privately. The simple answer is if you were relying on Privacy Shield, it's no longer valid, so you can't rely on it. You have to find something else. Right, super. Nice quick answer. Elaine, if you are on this stream still, you can track down David on the attendee list on the platform, and I'm pretty sure that he will be happy to answer your question. David, thank you very much indeed. Folks, we're now going to move on to Sorcha Lorimer from Trace Data. Sorcha's spoken for us a number of times before. We're delighted to have her back. We have had a slight slide issue, so I have got slides in the background if required, Sorcha. So if you have any issues, let me know, and I'll be your manual switch for the session. But that aside, over to you. And Sorcha is going to be talking about tips for good data sharing.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ray. I'll let you know if there's a problem and I'll cue you in. Thanks for having me. I've followed David before, so that's always a hard act to follow. But it was a brilliant session. And I'm so glad, David, that you took the Brexit questions so that possibly I can get to avoid them. And Ray's sharing the slides, so perfect. That makes my life easier. So just going to kick off. So who am I? I'm Sorcha Lorimer. I'm the founder of Trace. So Trace provide privacy solutions. We provide consultancy like DPI as a service. We also have online learning, and we have a GDPR app, which includes transfer assessments, which kind of visualizes those transfers, those international transfers, and helps you risk assess them. So makes life easier for that complicated maze that David was just talking about. So the purpose of this session, so just going to jump to the next slide of the agenda, Ray. So just going to unpack this agenda a little bit for you, and I'm conscious as well that I'm possibly keeping you from your lunch, so I'm going to try and keep it as light as possible and leave time for questions at the end. But what we're going to focus on is big data sharing, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and take a look at data sharing agreements, which many of you will know, but just unpack them a little bit. And thinking about how do you turn something which is quite static as a legal document into operationalizing that into practical governance. I'm then going to share with you my 7 tips. I love things in 7 steps, 7 tips. So 7 tips for practical governance underpinning that good data sharing. Then we're going to have a look at data sharing through the pandemic. 2020 is nearly an end, but we'll be taking a look back. We're still very much in the mix and look forward to thinking about, what's been going on this year and what any kind of lessons, and give you time for a discussion. I'm not sure how interactive that's going to be, but certainly if you've got questions on the chat, we can bring those out and leave at least 10 minutes at the end for that. So just jumping on to the next slide. So a big caveat, I'm not David Goodbrand, and this is not legal advice. I am a privacy professional, and I'm obviously very deeply involved in data governance. I typically work very closely with brilliant people like David, and work between the lawyers and the technologists to sort of translate those protocols that come out of contracts and turn them into actually how do we practically do that. But this is not the legal advice. So just jumping on, now we've got that caveat out the way. So data sharing, let's have a look at what do we mean by that data exchange. So I really love David's term earlier, which was about talking about, well, how do you kind of like pull data, personal data out of the open data or other sources of data? How do we think about structured and unstructured data? And that kind of sense of commingling, it makes it really, really hard. I mean, even the definition of personal data has just become so broad from GDPR that actually that in itself, you could be very much at the edges of what is private, and it gets very hard to get a very clear black and white picture in between, which means that GDPR becomes the default, which in some cases, you know, can be too heavy. So I think, you know, really the European Commission Data Governance Act, which is forthcoming, recognises that need to kind of enable good sharing, but separate through that respect for private data. So there's infinite sources of data, and we're obviously we're all living through a data-driven economy. It's just really kind of before, when you're thinking about data sharing, it's really to kind of tease out, you know, why is this sharing happening? What exactly is happening? And where does accountability lie? And importantly, when it comes to research or public data sources, thinking about what is really open data and what is really private, and how do you kind of like get a safe flow through the middle of that. And that's really complicated, because it's often not as simple as, well, this is open data and let's share it, versus this is personal data, or this is higher risk, because you can really play at the edges of that when you start to combine data sets and increase the re-identification risk. And so that's where it becomes a place where data protection and privacy is about the law and the legalities, but it's very much about risk management. So you need to have a kind of really good discipline of risk management to get this right. So there's lots to think about in terms of data exchange. We touched on already about what are the mechanisms for safe data sharing, whether it's end-to-end encryption or other means or that allow that sharing, and what are the controls in place and how do you operationalize them. And lots of challenges. So not just thinking about the GDPR, but intellectual property rights. What is the usage rights of this data? Can you publish it? Can you not publish it? How do you kind of tease out those categories of data within kind of large data sets? And how do you turn, as I said before, those static data sharing agreements into something which is meaningful and trackable? So you might have these good intentions, these great governance agreements and policies, but actually how living are they and how intelligent are they? So it's hugely complex. So next slide. Thank you, Ray. And we'll just flip on to the next one. So the data sharing, the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good and bad are, you know, have a lot of value behind them in terms of statements. So there's a lot of kind of weight behind them, but I'm going to just break this down in very simple terms for the purpose of this. So there's a lot of data sharing that is happening. Obviously, it's the basis of the world in which we live on, but actually it's really hard to kind of make all of that more transparent, more visible. And so if we look on the good side of what is good data sharing, that's the place where we want to be. So transparency is critical. So if you as a user or you're donating your data to a system, you're actively using a system, you want to know how your data or your critical information, your credit card data, you want to know how that's going to be used. You want to make that as clear as possible. You want to be able to have a privacy notice or terms and conditions which are easy to read. You want to know what happens to that data afterwards. You want to know whether, if there's value in that data, do you get the benefit of that value? So transparency is good data sharing. Is really, really hard to operationalize that in process, because, you know, inherently data is not a tangible and visible source. So as much as we can visualize that, the better. Good data sharing is proportionate to the need. It's based on necessity and proportionality, based on the GDPR, and that goes with all data sharing. It has a clear purpose. So when we think about data minimization, it kind of brings into mind about the kind of the size of the data sets. But it's not just about the size of the data. It's also, does that have a clear purpose? So if you're collecting and sharing and analyzing that data and aggregating that data for research purposes, what is that purpose? So that starts with that kind of like that clear brief and of what we're doing with that data. So that's the why. Accountability is a huge word in the GDPR, of course, but again, it flows down to what are the clear roles? This is an area which I see which causes a huge amount of confusion to this day. Am I the data controller? Am I the processor? Who's the sub-processor? Are we joint controllers? Are we independent controllers? But that a chain of accountability of when data is collected, who's responsible for what, who's responsible for protecting it, what if something goes wrong. That is vital. So good data sharing is based on accountability. Everyone's really, really clear on the rules, and they can demonstrate it, show not tell. Something I'm hugely passionate about personally is human-centered data protection, data sharing. So again, it's, you know, data itself as a source is not, it's not hugely visible or tangible. But if we can start to think about the person at the end of that chain and humanize the data, then I think we can make better, more ethical decisions. So we think about, okay, if we misuse this data, what is the harm that's going to happen to that person or to society at large? So human centricity and user centricity being a kind of core component of privacy by design. Let's look at the bad and the ugly. So invisible data sharing, the reality is a lot of it is very much in dark and lacks visibility. So I think we as a profession and the industry are trying to do a lot more to kind of make that a lot more visible. And the other kind of aspect is corporate interest first. So we don't have a level playing field. You know, there's very much a skew in terms of the big technology companies and their data models and how they kind of have been data hungry aggregators, and how do they use and monetize that data. So it's, at the moment we've got a disproportionate playing field, but over the next 10 years I see that changing. So I'm always hugely optimistic. And then again, that sort of, you know, that bad data sharing, when does good data sharing for wider good, I'm thinking about, you know, track and trace, when does it become state surveillance, when we have no privacy anymore and it intersects with our and infringes on our human rights. And that takes us towards ugly, which is, you know, then it's just plain illegal. You know, there's just not, you know, there's no kind of legal basis for the data collection, and it becomes unfair or unjust. Unfair is a huge kind of topic in its own right, in terms of massive data collection and training AI models, when we might bake in bias and we unfairly affect large swathes of society. So this is a huge topic which we're going to be exploring a lot in the next 5 or 10 years. So next slide. So data sharing agreements, they are a broad topology of agreements, and they're not necessarily always needed, but they're very good practice, and they kind of set out those kind of clear boundaries in the rules. So again, they can be set out in principle at the beginning, or then you can go into detail into kind of more specific contracts when they're needed for data protection agreements. So this is from the data sharing code from the ICO. So what do? They set out the purpose of their data sharing. They cover what's to happen, who's to do what, make sure that all the parties are clear on their roles. So that accountability piece that I talked about before, this really helps just get everything clear. And you know, if something goes wrong, if you don't have that kind of clarity at the outset of a project or initiative, you're going to go through a really tough time. So it's just making sure that the boundaries of relationships is a very good way to start any project. So next slide. Thanks, Ray. And data sharing agreements. So just a kind of quick check. Again, many people already on the call will know what these are, but you know, in basic terms, agreement between 2 or more people or entities. Many different types, reciprocal, one way, based on disclosure and so forth. And there's lots of different types of data, and that is really important for those legal obligations. So we're talking about, you know, there's confidentiality, intellectual property, does it need to be protected, and going towards the GDPR. So that kind of classification, categorization, understanding your data is vital. So next slide. So these are European Commission principles, which so they're not mine. They're principles. I do believe in a very principle-based approach, so I would encourage you to use them. And just talking about principles, as I said, principles like privacy by design or the core principles of the GDPR. I would recommend that everyone embraces an approach that's based on those principles, because you know you can get really lost in the nuance of the GDPR. You know, as David was talking about, reticence guidance. and then you can lose sight of the bigger picture. So if you can always dial things back to principles, it's a good way to start. So I kind of have a rule of 7, but whatever works for you. So you can see some of those principles that set out and govern data sharing that you can apply. But you can also see there's some potential tensions between B2B and B2G data sharing. And again, that's sort of playing out in the European Commission data governance. So next slide. Personal data, I'm just going to touch on this very briefly, but when as a data controller, so the organization or entity that collects the data subjects shares the data with the data processor, then you need a data processing agreement. So again, so it will set out those accountability principles, who's responsible for what. But one thing that I would really advocate here, and again, many in the call will know this already, is making sure that when you sign that contract that you go through it, word by word, letter by letter, and that you don't then put it on a shelf and leave it in a static document. You make sure that you have your active due diligence, and that's part of your compliance responsibility if you're sharing data with a data processor as a data controller, but you actually make that really active. So working through what are those, so gaining real assurance, and it's show not tell in terms of what are the technical and organizational measures, making sure that phrases in data protection clauses are not just there because they're based on what sounds good, but actually making sure that that's attested and making it and really reassuring that the data is protected throughout its flow when we're talking about personal data. So next slide. So I'm going to share my 7 tips for good data sharing. I'm going to fly through these, and again, I've got much more detail behind it if anyone would like to explore that. But I'm kind of packing quite a lot in the next 10 minutes. So these are kind of tips for if you, as a data controller or an organization, if you are planning to share data with another entity for commercial or public good or research or rationale. So some key things to think about, and really setting out those principles before you commence the data sharing. And this is based on experience. I've had quite a lot of experience, particularly in 2020, on working on big data sharing and working with researchers. So these are based on real world experience. But I've also had experience in terms of the research space, but also the commercial space. And I think these kind of tips should hopefully be applicable to both. So first tip is there are lots of challenges with data governance. So start with the why is a kind of key mantra. So working out why are you doing this data sharing, for what purpose, with whom, and so making sure that you have that purpose from the outset. So a bugbear of mine would be that organizations would jump in to writing the contract before kind of dialing back from working out what the kind of project and the scope is all about. That doesn't lead things to a good place, and that applies to any contract. And again, if you want to say that we've got good data sharing agreements, that this has to be the approach. So sort of doing it the other way around is absolutely not good practice. So tip 2. Know your data. Again, I'm going back to David, your point there in terms of that kind of like commingling and sort of teasing out of that data, but really understanding the type of data, its nature and implications for risk and liability. Don't just think about GDPR, think about, well, which laws of the land are we dealing with here, and what about contract law, what about intellectual property, what about value chain, so forth. So really you have to look at data protocols and regulations in that kind of wider mix. If you're thinking about research data, again, it's very useful to look at the FAIR principles for data and also the 5 SAFE. So there's lots of different frameworks to kind of play through, and so it's useful to take the time to do that. And next up. And so that kind of leads me to my next path, is mapping that legal pathway. And a golden rule, particularly for personal data, don't collect or share what you can't protect or don't have a legal basis for. So that's an absolute golden rule for GDPR, again, which many of you know already, is identifying that legal basis before you start to collect it. So working through your DPIAs, and if it's legitimate interest assessment. And tip 4. I already talked about the importance of humanizing data protection. So that user centricity and applying those principles of privacy by design. I'm not going to go through those principles at the moment, but again, we've got more material on the principles of privacy by design and applying those models. But that is a critical principle at the start of it all, is thinking about the end user. So it's about respecting the end user or the data donor or whoever is involved in creating that data when it's personal data. They have rights. The personal data rights are not absolute, but they have rights, and so you have to think about how you're going to respect them from the outset. So critical would be, right to be informed in terms of how this data is going to be used. And again, it's quite difficult to make really concise privacy notices, but we should absolutely be continually striving towards that, so that when people are reading the privacy notices or the terms, they actually understand what's going to happen as much as possible. So I think we've got a long journey to go on that one, but that's key. Tip 5. So I've already talked about the data sharing agreements as a term, and under a subset of that, you could have information sharing agreements. Some people call them access agreements, and you've got your data protection agreements and so forth. So just making sure that underneath that kind of subset, you have the right type of agreement and reflecting on the type of data sharing that's happening, whether it's confidentiality or whether it's coming into personal data. And tip 6. So manage your data and privacy risk. So use data protection impact assessments when required and navigate the legal basis to ensure accountability. So again, I'm very passionate about DPIAs not just being this tick box exercise. You obviously need them, and the sequencing of the DPIAs is really, really vital. And we've had some kind of big cases in 2020 where the sequencing wasn't right, unfortunately, for DPIAs. But I think with DPIAs, it's about making that risk really, owned by the wider team or the wider organization, and really, discussed and kind of pulled apart. So making those documents not just something that someone at the DPO or whoever goes through at the start of it, but actually, reopening the DPIA when you need to, talking about what's in it, thinking of it as a living document and a living tool rather than, again, that static document. And that's how you genuinely kind of build in the accountability. So next slide. End-to-end, so the cradle-to-grave approach for data governance, I'm sure many will be aware of. So your data lifecycle, again, really thinking back to that lineage piece. Where was that data first collected? Go and ask the hard questions. Don't assume that whatever data that you might be getting in the chain is legitimate, okay. Going back and visualizing that cradle to grave approach and that life cycle. How will it be shared? How will it be securely deleted thereafter? Will there be relevant kind of termination or sunset clauses that you need to think about? So by visualizing that out, which I think is key, and many of you will do, you start to sort of think about, okay, we're transferring it through and then we're going to delete it. How are we going to operationalize that governance again, translating from the static documents into something more meaningful? Okay, so that's my 7 tips. So I think hopefully I'm looking at the clock now. We've got another 3 minutes. So just really to kind of pause there and sort of reflect back on 2020, if we may. I know 2020 isn't done yet, but I am sort of in a state of mind where I'm thinking back to what's happened in 2020 and looking forward. And this pandemic started in March, and to be honest, at that time, I felt a little bit fearful for privacy by design and kind of consciousness about it. I thought that it might go out the window. I mean, we saw that with 9/11, where the bigger state and the emergency regulation and legislation came in, and that became the big focus. And absolutely, that has happened, but actually there's also been, I believe, a rising consciousness towards privacy and state surveillance and what that means for us in terms of how that might infringe on human rights. We've seen that with the Black Lives Matter movement, where again we've had this kind of mass tracking technology and Armory come in and actually sort of see the interplay of how can we respect and protect the user and the privacy and their individual rights versus the need for the very data-driven operation. So I just want to pause there and say, well, that's what I'm looking back on, and very hopeful as I look forward that we've got a lot of lessons coming out of 2020, but certainly privacy is not off the agenda, data protection is not off the agenda, and these kind of forces coming together, and to see whether there are any questions from the attendees.
Thank you very much indeed, Sorcha. It took me back to the 90s there with the manual slide share when Bluetooth really wasn't a mainstream thing, was it? I had to do that a few years ago at our oil and gas summit when the clicker went down. So not only have we sort of been faced with that challenge, but it's just brought back a few good memories as well. So glad I could help there. That was fun. There was one question. I'm not going to out the person who asked it because as he described it himself, it's a bit of a noddy question. What does B to G mean? I Googled it and I think it's business to government. Would I be correct?
Yes, that's correct. So we're public and private, exactly.
Exactly. Sorcha, thank you very much indeed. Very enlightening discussion. And we're going to close the session there. If you do want any more discussions with Sorcha, are you on the platform, Sorcha, at the moment? Are you on the event platform?
I am not, but I can jump back in. I can jump onto that.
Super. Well, what I'll do is I'll leave that last slide up with Sorcha's details. If you do want to maintain direct contact with Sorcha, of course, you'll find her on LinkedIn as well. Thank you very much indeed. For those of you still in the session, these sessions are recorded. If you have missed anything over the course of the hour and a half we've been on here, we will have this up on YouTube, possibly by the end of the day, but certainly by tomorrow. And what we will be doing is emailing that out to everybody as well. But from myself, thank you to Sorcha, thank you to Chris Dyer, and also thank you to David Goodbrand. Next session, I believe, will be starting at 1:30, where we'll have Toby Hayes, who is the global data protection crawler from Pladis Globalt. If you don't know who Pladis Globalt are, I think that's McVitie's, isn't it? That's big biscuit manufacturers. So come on, and Toby has spoken for us before. He's an absolute stellar presenter. That will kick off at 1:30. We've got, I think, just over an hour now between that session and now. So please do visit our exhibitors, go and have a chat with them. There's also some thematic chat lounges, and if you haven't done our poll, please go and do that. But from myself and our speakers, thank you very much indeed.